Richard Whitmore's hand started shaking before he even reached the last page in the folder. I still remember the sound the paper made in that dining room. Thick cardstock scraping softly against polished oak, crystal glasses, silver utensils, somebody's nervous cough near the fireplace. Then silence. The kind of silence that only happens when wealthy people realize they've said the wrong thing in front of the wrong person. Richard's face had gone completely white. Not embarrassed. Not uncomfortable. Terrified. Across the table, his wife Evelyn was still holding her wineglass near her lips, frozen halfway through a sip. "What is that?" she asked quietly. Richard didn't answer her. He kept staring at the documents like they'd crawled out of a grave. And that was the moment my son finally looked at me the way he hadn't looked at me in years. Like he was seeing me clearly. But to explain how we got to that dinner table, I have to go back about 3 weeks earlier to a rainy Tuesday afternoon in Akron, Ohio. I was standing in the kitchen trying to glue the loose corner back onto an old photo album when Daniel called. "Mom," he said carefully, "Claire's parents want to host a dinner before the engagement party." I tucked the phone between my shoulder and ear while pressing the velvet cover flat. "That sounds nice." There was a pause. "It's kind of formal." I smiled a little at that. Daniel always sounded uncomfortable when rich people acted rich around me. "Well, I said I still know how to use a fork." He let out a quiet laugh, but it disappeared quickly. "You don't have to bring anything." That hurt more than I let him hear. I wasn't planning to show up empty-handed. "No, Mom, I just mean, they already have everything." That sentence stayed with me long after we hung up. They already have everything. People like Claire's family always did seem to have everything. Large homes, vacation properties, matching Christmas pajamas and framed photographs, expensive kitchen appliances nobody actually used. Meanwhile, my refrigerator still made a clicking noise every few hours because I couldn't afford to replace it. But I knew Daniel wasn't trying to insult me. My son had spent most of his adult life trying to stand in 2 different worlds without upsetting either one. I just wasn't sure anymore which world embarrassed him more. That night I pulled out the old cedar chest from my bedroom closet. Inside were the few things I'd managed to keep after Thomas died. My husband had been gone nearly 8 years by then, but sometimes it still surprised me to say the word widow out loud. I found the silver serving spoon his mother brought from Pennsylvania after the war, tarnished but beautiful underneath if you polished it enough. Then I found the old family photo album. Daniel at age 6 holding a fish too big for his hands. Thomas asleep in a lawn chair during a church picnic. Christmas mornings in our tiny split-level house. Nothing expensive. Nothing impressive. Just proof that we'd loved each other well. I spent nearly a week restoring that album. New corner tabs, fresh protective sheets, little handwritten notes beneath the photographs. By Friday, my fingers ached from glue and polishing cream. I wrapped the spoon in soft cloth and placed everything carefully inside a plain brown paper gift bag from Miller's Pharmacy downtown. That was the best I could do. And honestly, I was proud of it. The dinner was held at the Whitmore's house outside Chicago the following Saturday. Daniel picked me up from my hotel himself. He looked tired before we even reached the driveway. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah." "You don't sound okay." He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Claire's mom can just be a little..." He searched for the word. "Formal." I smiled gently. "Daniel, I raised you. I know when you're trying not to say something." He sighed. "She cares a lot about appearances." I looked out the window as enormous homes rolled past us like something from a real estate magazine. Most insecure people do. That surprised a laugh out of him. For a second he sounded like my little boy again. The Whitmore's house looked less like a home and more like a private resort. Stone entrance, perfect landscaping, massive windows glowing warm against the evening sky. Inside, everything smelled faintly of expensive candles and lemon polish. Evelyn Whitmore greeted me wearing cream-colored silk and a smile that never reached her eyes. "Margaret," she said warmly, "we're so glad you could come." People who speak that carefully usually aren't. I handed her my coat. Then she noticed the paper bag. Her eyes lingered on it for 1 second too long. "Oh," she said brightly, "you brought something." I nodded. "Just a small family gift for the kids." "Well," she replied, "that's very thoughtful." That pause before thoughtful told me everything. The house slowly filled with guests. Claire's aunt and uncle from Milwaukee, Richard's business partner and his wife, a few family friends from their country club. Everyone carried themselves with that same polished ease wealthy people learn over decades. I stayed quiet and tried not to look out of place. Claire, to her credit, hugged me warmly when she arrived. "You look beautiful tonight," she whispered. "So do you, sweetheart." And she did. She had kind eyes. That mattered more to me than her parents' money ever would. Dinner cocktails were served in a sitting room larger than my entire first floor back home. I was standing near the fireplace when Evelyn finally opened the paper bag. She removed the photo album first. Then the spoon. I watched her expression change almost invisibly. Not confusion. Disappointment. And then came the sentence. Soft enough to sound private. Loud enough for everyone to hear. Now I see why Daniel never talks about where he came from. A few people looked down immediately. One woman pretended to adjust her bracelet. Someone near the bar cleared his throat awkwardly. And my son froze. I could actually see the shame hit him. Not because of me. Because he hadn't protected me. I smiled before anybody could pity me. "It's getting late," I said quietly. "I should probably head out before dinner starts." Nobody stopped me at first. Not Evelyn. Not Richard. Not even Claire, who looked horrified. I reached for my purse. And then Daniel stood up. Without saying a word, he walked to his briefcase near the entry table, pulled out a thick folder, and slid it directly in front of Richard Whitmore. Richard opened it casually at first. Then his entire face changed. His lips parted slightly. His hand began trembling against the paper. And suddenly the most powerful man in that room looked like he couldn't breathe. I stayed standing beside my chair while Richard Whitmore stared down at those papers like they might explode in his hands. Nobody in the room spoke. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked so loudly it almost sounded aggressive. Finally, Evelyn set her wine glass down. "Richard," she asked carefully. He still didn't answer. Daniel stood beside the table with his jaw tight, one hand resting against the back of his chair. I hadn't seen that expression on my son's face since he was 17 and nearly got into a fight protecting a smaller boy outside his high school gymnasium. Controlled anger. The dangerous kind. Claire looked between her father and fiancé. "What is it?" Richard swallowed hard before looking up at me. "Where did you get these?" His voice sounded thinner than before. Daniel answered for me. "I found them in Mom's attic 3 weeks ago." Richard's eyes returned immediately to the folder. Inside were copies of loan agreements, notarized documents, canceled checks, mortgage records, and old correspondence from a regional bank in northern Ohio dated back to 1998. Ancient history to most people. Not to Richard. He knew exactly what he was looking at. Evelyn finally stepped closer and reached for one of the papers. Richard pulled it away too quickly. That frightened her more than the documents themselves. "Richard," she whispered, "what is going on?" He looked around the room slowly, suddenly aware that every guest was watching him unravel in real time. Then he said something I never expected to hear again. "Thomas." Just my husband's name. Barely above a whisper. I felt my chest tighten. Thomas Doyle had been dead nearly 8 years, but hearing his name spoken inside a house like that felt strange somehow, like somebody had carried a piece of our old life into a room where it never belonged. Daniel looked at me. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me?" I opened my mouth, but Richard spoke first. "Oh my God." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "Oh my God." Evelyn's polished composure finally cracked. "Tell us what?" Richard looked at her with something close to shame. "In 98, he began quietly, the company almost collapsed." Claire frowned. "What company?" "My first construction business." Claire blinked. "You told us Grandpa helped you." "He did, at first." Richard's voice sounded distant now, almost detached from the room itself. "But then we got hit with the lawsuit." I remembered that lawsuit. Everyone in our church did. One of Richard's development projects had become tangled in a zoning dispute and a subcontractor injury claim at the same time. The bank started threatening foreclosure within months. Back then, Richard wasn't wealthy. He was desperate. And desperate people look very different before success smooths the edges off them. Daniel slowly sat back down. "You knew my dad." Richard looked at him. Knew him, he let out a hollow little laugh. Your father kept me alive. The room went silent again. Claire looked genuinely confused now. What are you talking about? Richard rubbed both hands together nervously. I was done, he admitted. Absolutely done. I couldn't make payroll, couldn't refinance. I was about to lose the business, the house, everything. His eyes shifted toward me. I went to Pastor Wheeler because I needed advice. He told me someone in the congregation might be willing to help temporarily. Daniel frowned. Dad loaned you money? Richard nodded once. Your father and mother took out a second mortgage on their home. Claire stared at me in disbelief. I hated this part. Not because I was ashamed. Because Thomas never wanted anybody to know. I finally sat back down slowly. It was a long time ago. Daniel turned toward me immediately. How much? I didn't answer. Richard did. Almost 200,000. The room physically reacted to that number. One guest inhaled sharply. Evelyn looked at Richard as though she'd never seen him before. You told me your uncle covered the emergency financing. Richard lowered his eyes. That's what I said. What do you mean that's what you said? He couldn't look at her anymore. Because it sounded better. Nobody moved. Nobody even touched their drinks now. Daniel looked sick. You mortgaged the house, he asked me quietly. I nodded. Your father believed people deserved help when life cornered them. And you never told me. I looked down at my hands. They weren't your burdens to carry. That was true. But it wasn't the entire truth. The truth was uglier than that. The loan damaged us badly. When Richard's company finally stabilized years later, the repayment came slowly and unevenly. Then Thomas got sick. Then the hospital bills started piling up. There were years we barely stayed afloat. I worked double shifts at the nursing home while Thomas quietly sold tools from the garage one by one without telling me. Daniel never knew because we made sure he didn't. Parents from our generation were built that way. We carried things privately. Across the room, Evelyn sat down slowly like her knees had weakened. You mean she said carefully the reason Richard still has this company? She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Claire looked pale now, too. My entire childhood, she whispered. Richard covered his face briefly with one hand. I paid them back. His voice cracked defensively. With interest. I answered gently before anybody else could. Yes, eventually. But money wasn't really the point anymore. Not after all those years. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment. I could practically see his entire understanding of his childhood rearranging itself inside his mind. Every postponed vacation. Every second-hand car. Every conversation cut short when bills arrived in the mail. Suddenly none of it looked the same. Claire spoke next very softly. Why wouldn't you tell us? Richard looked at her with exhausted eyes. Because after the company succeeded, he admitted quietly, I wanted to believe I did it myself. Nobody judged him out loud. That was the strange thing. At our age, most people understand weakness better than they understand perfection. Still, shame settled over the room like heavy fog. Evelyn looked over at the photo album still sitting on the side table. The old silver spoon rested beside it under the soft lamplight. A family gift. Not impressive enough for her 10 minutes earlier. Now she couldn't even look directly at it. Daniel finally turned toward me again. Mom, he said carefully, did Dad regret helping him? I answered honestly. No. That part mattered. Your father believed people should be judged by what they do after they fall apart, not before. Richard closed his eyes for a second after hearing that. And for the first time all evening he looked less like a wealthy businessman, and more like the frightened young father I remembered from 25 years ago, sitting at our kitchen table with unpaid bills spread in front of him. After the guests finally left that night, I sat alone in the hotel room staring at the ice bucket beside the television for nearly an hour without turning the TV on once. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet cleaner. Outside, tires hissed along wet pavement below my window. I should have felt vindicated after what happened at dinner. Maybe even satisfied. But mostly I just felt tired. At 64, revenge doesn't land the same way it does in movies. You don't stand there feeling victorious while dramatic music swells in the background. You mostly wonder whether everybody involved could have spared themselves 20 years of pain by simply telling the truth sooner. Around midnight, somebody knocked softly at my door. I already knew it was Daniel. Mothers always know the rhythm of their children's knocks. I opened the door, and there he stood wearing jeans and the same navy sweater from dinner hands shoved deep into his pockets, like he used to do as a teenager whenever guilt got hold of him. "Can I come in?" "Of course." He stepped inside quietly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked around the little hotel room, the floral bedspread, the outdated lamp, the tiny coffee machine near the television. And I could see something painful crossing his face. Not embarrassment this time. Recognition. "You shouldn't be staying somewhere like this," he muttered. I smiled faintly. "Honey, this place is perfectly fine." But he kept looking around. I knew what he was seeing. A woman who spent 40 years sacrificing comfort so everybody else could feel secure. That realization can hit adult children hard when it finally arrives. Daniel sat at the small table by the window while I poured him stale hotel coffee neither of us really wanted. Finally, he looked up at me. "Why didn't you tell me about Dad helping Richard?" I sat across from him slowly. "Because your father made me promise." "That's insane." "No," I said gently, "it was pride." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "You lost the house because of that loan." "We almost did." His eyes widened. "You never said anything." "What good would it have done?" "That was my childhood." I nodded once. "Yes." The pain in his voice nearly broke me then. "Not anger." "Grief." The grief adult children feel when they realize their parents were human beings the entire time, instead of permanent fixtures holding up the walls of their lives. Daniel leaned back heavily in the chair. "I used to think you and Dad just didn't know how to manage money." I laughed softly despite myself. "Oh, we knew." That surprised a reluctant smile out of him. But only for a second. Then his face darkened again. "All those years," he whispered. "I used to compare us to other families." "I know. Especially families like Claire's." I reached across the table and rested my hand over his. "There's nothing wrong with wanting a comfortable life, Daniel. That's not what bothers me." He looked down. "What bothers me is I let them make you feel small tonight." I squeezed his hand gently. "You froze. Human beings freeze sometimes." But I knew how her mother was. "Yes," I said quietly, "you did." That landed hard. He looked away toward the rain sliding down the window. "When I first met Claire's parents, he admitted I thought they were everything I wanted to become." I didn't interrupt him. At their house, everybody seemed so polished, so successful. He laughed bitterly. Nobody argued over medical bills. Nobody patched old roofs themselves on weekends. Nobody clipped coupons at the kitchen table. I smiled sadly. "You noticed that stuff." "Mom, I noticed everything." That hurt to hear because I suddenly realized how carefully he must have hidden those feelings growing up. Children always know more than parents think they do. Daniel rubbed his eyes. "And the worst part," he continued quietly, "I think part of me started acting embarrassed by where I came from." I stayed silent. He needed to say it out loud himself. There were times at work when people asked about my family. He swallowed hard, and I'd change the subject. That confession clearly disgusted him. But honestly, it didn't shock me. America has a way of teaching people that struggling quietly somehow makes you less valuable than people born comfortable. Especially ambitious young people trying to climb professionally. I understood it better than he realized. "You know what your father used to say?" I asked. Daniel shook his head. He said shame grows best in silence. Daniel stared at the table. "I don't deserve what Dad did for me." "Yes, you do." "How?" "Because he chose it freely." That mattered. Thomas Doyle never helped Richard expecting praise. He did it because somebody asked for help and he believed refusing would have haunted him more than the financial risk itself. That was the kind of man he was. Daniel suddenly looked up again. "Claire didn't know either." "I believe that." "She cried after you left." That surprised me a little. Claire always seemed emotionally careful around her parents, especially her mother. I suspected she'd spent years learning not to challenge them too directly. "Her father lied to her entire life," Daniel said quietly, "and somehow I think that's hurting her even more than the money part." I nodded slowly. Because children build their identities around the stories their parents tell them. And when those stories crack open, everything underneath shifts too. The next morning, Claire herself called me. I almost didn't answer, but something in my gut told me I should. "Margaret," she asked softly after I picked up. "Yes, sweetheart." There was a long silence. Then she said the last thing I expected. "I'm ashamed of my family." "No," I answered immediately. "Don't carry other people's mistakes for them." "But my mother." "Your mother grew comfortable," I said gently. "Comfort changes people slowly. Most don't even notice it happening." Claire's voice trembled slightly. "I don't know who my father is anymore." "Yes, you do." She went quiet. "He's the man who survived because someone helped him," I continued. "Now he has to decide what kind of man he wants to be after remembering that." Another long pause followed. Then Claire asked softly, "Do you hate them?" I looked out the hotel window at the gray Chicago morning, at people carrying umbrellas, at buses splashing through intersections, at ordinary lives moving forward. And I answered honestly, no, because hate gets heavier after 60. Most people our age already carry enough. Over the next month, wedding planning turned into something that felt less like a celebration and more like a slow negotiation between two different versions of America. One version believed appearances kept families respectable. The other believed families survived by quietly helping one another when life became difficult. Unfortunately, those two versions had just been forced into the same room. Daniel called me almost every evening after the dinner at the Whitmores. Not long conversations. Just check-ins. "How was your day? You eating okay? Did the pharmacy finally fix your prescription?" Small things. But after years of emotional distance, those small things mattered more than grand apologies ever could. Claire called too. Sometimes separately from Daniel. Sometimes late at night after she'd argued with her parents. I never asked for details, but eventually she started telling me anyway. "My mother wants a 12-piece string quartet for the reception." I smiled into the phone while folding laundry. "That sounds expensive." "She thinks the wedding should feel elevated." "That usually means expensive." Claire laughed softly. Then her voice dropped. "She keeps making comments." "What kind of comments?" "About simplicity, about image, about how people will talk." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. "Sweetheart," I said gently, "your mother spent a long time building a life where appearances protected her from insecurity. People don't give that up overnight." Claire sighed heavily. "I just don't understand why she cares so much what strangers think." I looked around my little kitchen. The faded curtains. The old clock Thomas once repaired 3 different times instead of replacing. The tiny scratch on the cabinet from when Daniel dropped a baseball bat indoors at age 11. When people build their identity around status, I said quietly, other people's opinions become oxygen. Claire went silent after that. I think she understood more than she wanted to. Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore disappeared almost entirely from wedding planning. That alone told me more than words could. Men like Richard usually solved discomfort by controlling situations, but now he seemed unable to control his own memories. Daniel told me Richard had started spending long hours alone in his office after work, looking through old files, old photographs, old business records. Sometimes regret arrives all at once. Sometimes it enters room by room. One afternoon, Daniel drove down to Ohio unexpectedly. I nearly dropped the watering can when I saw his car pull into the driveway. "What are you doing here on a Thursday?" I asked as he hugged me. He smelled faintly of aftershave and cold autumn air. I needed a break. That wasn't the full truth, but I let him have it. Inside the house, he wandered slowly through rooms he'd known his entire life. Only now he seemed to notice things differently. The worn carpet near the stairs. The patched ceiling stain above the hallway. The old recliner Thomas refused to throw away even after the springs broke. Daniel stopped near the garage doorway. "Dad sold his tools, didn't he?" I looked down at my coffee cup. "Some of them?" "When?" "During chemo." He closed his eyes briefly. That hit him harder than the loan. Because tools were part of who Thomas Doyle had been. Giving them up quietly meant things had gotten much worse than Daniel ever realized. "I was away at college," he whispered. "You were building your future." I should have noticed. Honey, I said gently, parents from our generation spent half our lives making sure our children didn't notice. That almost made him cry. I could see it. Instead, he walked toward the back porch and stared outside for a long moment. You know what scares me? He finally asked. What? I think I was starting to become like them. I walked beside him slowly. No, I said. You were starting to believe success required hiding struggle. He looked at me carefully after that. And for the first time in years, I think my son truly understood where he came from. A week later, I attended a wedding tasting event at the country club outside Naperville. Truthfully, I almost didn't go. But Claire personally asked me. I don't want you disappearing from this wedding, she told me firmly. That sentence stayed with me. The country club looked exactly the way wealthy country clubs always do. Polished wood, oversized flower arrangements, older men discussing golf memberships, women wearing cashmere in temperatures that didn't require it. I arrived 15 minutes early and instantly regretted coming. Evelyn stood near the banquet manager reviewing centerpiece samples. She greeted me politely enough, but tension still clung to her like perfume. Margaret, she said, you found the place all right? Yes. She nodded stiffly. Then, while reviewing menu cards, she casually added, Claire wants something more understated now. Apparently modesty is becoming fashionable again. The comment was subtle enough to deny later. That made it worse. I pretended not to react. But Claire heard it immediately. So is kindness, she said sharply from across the table. The room froze. Even the banquet manager looked uncomfortable. Evelyn blinked slowly. What's that supposed to mean? Claire stepped forward calmly. It means I'm tired of every conversation becoming about status. Evelyn's face reddened slightly. I'm trying to create a beautiful wedding. You're trying to impress people you don't even like. Silence. Pure silence. I watched Richard standing farther near the windows, holding a coffee cup, completely motionless. Claire's voice trembled now, but she kept going. You humiliated Daniel's mother in front of strangers. Then we found out her family helped save ours. She swallowed hard. And somehow you're still worried about centerpiece fabrics. Claire Evelyn warned quietly. No, Claire replied. I'm serious. I don't want a marriage built around pretending we're better than other people. That sentence landed like a crack through glass. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Richard quietly set his untouched coffee down and walked out of the room without saying a word. About 10 days after the country club incident, Richard Whitmore showed up at my house carrying a grocery store apple pie and looking about 15 years older than the last time I'd seen him. I almost didn't recognize him standing on my porch. Not because his appearance had changed dramatically, because pride had. Pride alters people more than age ever does. For most of his adult life, Richard had carried himself like a man permanently walking into a board meeting. Straight spine, controlled expression, expensive watch visible at all times. Now he stood there gripping a pie box with both hands like a nervous church volunteer. Well, I said softly after opening the door, this is unexpected. He gave a small embarrassed nod. I was driving through Akron after a meeting. That's a 3-hour detour from Chicago. A faint smile touched his face. Yes, he admitted, it is. For a moment we simply looked at each other. Then I stepped aside. You might as well come in. The house suddenly felt much smaller with someone like Richard Whitmore standing inside it. Not because of his money. Because certain people carry years of unspoken history into rooms with them. He looked around slowly while I took his coat. Thomas's old fishing hat still hung near the laundry room door. The wallpaper near the dining area needed replacing. The hardwood floors creaked in familiar places. Nothing polished. Nothing curated. Just a life lived honestly for a long time. I brought pie, Richard said awkwardly. That's very brave, I replied. I'm an Ohio woman. We judge pie harshly here. To my surprise, he laughed. Really laughed. And suddenly I caught a glimpse of the younger man Thomas once described to me years ago before success hardened his edges. I made coffee while Richard sat quietly at the kitchen table. The same table where he'd once sat nearly 26 years earlier with foreclosure notices spread in front of him. I think he realized that too. His eyes kept drifting toward the surface of the table like ghosts might still be sitting there. Finally he spoke. I haven't slept properly since that dinner. I handed him a mug. Guilt's expensive that way. He nodded slowly. You know, he said after a moment, for years I convinced myself I paid your husband back completely. You did financially, but not morally. I sat across from him. Outside, wind rattled the nearly bare branches in the backyard. Richard rubbed his hands together slowly before continuing. When I came to Thomas for help, he shook his head faintly. I was humiliated, completely humiliated. I remembered. Back then, he'd looked exhausted all the time. His suits never fit correctly because stress weight kept disappearing from him week by week. You know what scared me most? He asked quietly. Losing everything. No. He looked down into his coffee, having people see me lose everything. That answer didn't surprise me at all. Men from Richard's generation were often taught their worth depended entirely on appearing successful. Failure wasn't just financial. It was personal shame. He sat right there, Richard said softly, glancing around the kitchen, and told me something I've never forgotten. I stayed quiet. Richard swallowed hard. He said bad years happen faster than people think. That sounded exactly like Thomas. Simple, direct, no performance. Richard let out a shaky breath. I remember waiting for him to judge me. His eyes grew distant, but he never did. Because Thomas understood working people. He understood layoffs, back injuries, medical debt, overtime disappearing without warning. Life had humbled him early enough to make him kinder instead of bitter. Richard looked around the kitchen again. His eyes landed on the old radiator near the sink. You still have this thing? It still works. Barely. So do I. Another laugh escaped him unexpectedly. Then his expression changed again. Heavy this time. I buried what your family did for me, he admitted quietly. Not because I forgot. He paused. Because I wanted to. I appreciated the honesty. Most people never reach that level of truth about themselves. Success changes memory, I said gently. It changes character too. That one hurt him. I could see it immediately. He leaned back heavily in his chair. When the company finally succeeded, he continued, people started calling me self-made. And you liked hearing it? Yes. At least he didn't lie anymore. That story sounded cleaner than the truth. He looked down again. Cleaner than admitting another family nearly destroyed themselves helping mine survive. I folded my hands together quietly. You know what the strange part is, he asked. What? The money wasn't even what saved me. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? Richard's eyes grew wet for the first time. Your husband treated me like I was still worth something. That nearly broke me. Because that was Thomas. Even during his own hardest years, he somehow made struggling people feel less ashamed of struggling. Richard looked toward the living room where Thomas's old recliner still sat near the television. You kept his chair. He liked that chair. It's falling apart. He was two by the end. Silence settled gently after that. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. Finally, Richard looked at me carefully. I owe you an apology. I smiled faintly. You owe several people one. Yes, he admitted, but especially you. I waited. He swallowed hard before speaking. When Evelyn made that comment at dinner, his voice lowered. I should have stopped her immediately. Yes, I said quietly, you should have. He nodded once, accepting it. I spent years teaching myself how to command rooms. His expression darkened, and somewhere along the way I forgot how to protect decent people inside them. That sentence stayed with me. Because underneath the wealth and ego and mistakes, I suddenly saw a man deeply afraid of what success had slowly turned him into. Then Richard looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and whispered the one thing I never expected him to say. Tom would be ashamed of me. I stared at my coffee cup for a long moment before answering. No? Richard looked surprised. He'd be disappointed, I continued softly. But your mistake wasn't falling apart. I met his eyes carefully. It was forgetting who helped you stand back up. And for the first time since arriving, Richard Whitmore finally cried. Quietly. Like a man mourning the person he used to be. The morning of the wedding arrived cold and gray with the kind of November rain that made church parking lots smell like wet leaves and old pavement. I almost didn't go. That wasn't drama. It was exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion settles differently once you get older. After a while, your spirit starts protecting itself from rooms where humiliation might be waiting. I stood in my bedroom staring at the navy blue dress hanging from the closet door, while the local news played softly in the background. Traffic updates, football scores, a story about rising grocery prices. Ordinary American life continuing forward while families quietly complicated themselves behind closed doors. My church friend Linda had helped me pick the dress 2 weeks earlier. It's elegant, she'd insisted. It's from Kohl's. So, that was Linda. Practical enough to survive anything. I finally sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the framed photo beside the lamp. Thomas smiling beside Lake Erie, holding a burnt hamburger spatula like a trophy. I picked up the frame carefully. Well, I whispered to him, "Your boy's getting married today." My voice cracked on the last word. Not because of sadness. Because Thomas should have been there. Parents spend years imagining these milestones without realizing how painful they become when somebody's missing from the picture. Around 9:30, my phone rang. Daniel. I answered immediately. "Morning, sweetheart." "Mom." He paused. "You ready?" I looked at the dress again. Truthfully, number. But parents don't answer questions like that honestly on important days. Almost. There was silence on the line. Then he said quietly, "You were thinking about not coming." I closed my eyes. Mothers forget sometimes that children learn our emotional rhythms too. A little. Another silence. Then I heard car keys jingling. "I'm outside." "What?" "I came to get you." I walked to the front window. And there he was standing beside his car, in the rain, wearing his dark suit hands shoved into his coat pockets, exactly the way Thomas used to stand during uncomfortable conversations. Something inside me softened immediately. I opened the door before he could knock. "You drove all the way here first?" "Yes." "You're getting married in 3 hours." "I know." Rain dotted his shoulders as he stepped inside. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel looked around the house quietly. "You know," he said softly, "when I was younger, I thought this place looked small." I smiled faintly. "And now? Now it looks safe." That nearly made me cry before 10 in the morning. Instead, I adjusted his tie slightly. "You nervous?" "Terrified." "Good, means you understand marriage." That earned a real laugh from him. The church ceremony itself was beautiful, in the simple, old-fashioned way weddings sometimes still are in the Midwest. Dark wood pews, soft organ music, older relatives whispering too loudly near the entrance. Claire looked radiant walking down the aisle, but what struck me most was how emotional she became seeing Daniel waiting at the altar. Not polished. Not performative. Real. That mattered more than flower arrangements ever would. Evelyn greeted me politely before the ceremony began. Still careful. Still slightly stiff. But different now. Less superior. More uncertain. And Richard. Richard looked exhausted. Not physically. Spiritually. Like a man carrying decades of delayed honesty toward a microphone he could no longer avoid. The ceremony passed peacefully enough. Vows. Tears. Laughter during the ring mishap when Daniel nearly dropped Claire's band. For a few hours, everybody behaved like ordinary families trying their best. But the reception was where everything changed. The ballroom overlooked a small lake behind the venue. White lights reflected against the water while older relatives danced carefully to Sinatra covers from a local band. I stayed mostly near the edge of the room, speaking with Claire's aunt from Milwaukee, who turned out to be surprisingly kind once removed from Evelyn's orbit. Dinner had just ended when I overheard 2 women near the dessert table whispering. "Which side is she from?" "The groom's mother." "The one from Ohio?" A pause. Then quietly. "Well, you can definitely tell the difference." I felt the old familiar sting rise in my chest again. Not rage. Weariness. Just weariness. I suddenly realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my life standing in rooms trying to prove dignity to people who measured human worth by zip code and table settings. So I picked up my purse quietly and headed toward the exit. Halfway across the ballroom, Daniel intercepted me. "Where are you going?" "I'm tired." His eyes moved immediately toward the gossiping women behind me. Then back to me. "Don't leave." Sweetheart. Please. That word stopped me. Not because he sounded desperate. Because he sounded like a little boy again. Then the microphone squealed softly near the dance floor. Richard Whitmore stood slowly from the head table holding a champagne glass in one hand. The room gradually quieted. I know Daniel and Claire already did speeches, he began carefully, but there's something I need to say tonight. Evelyn looked alarmed instantly. Richard ignored her. I spent most of my adult life believing success meant never letting people see how badly you once struggled. The ballroom grew silent. I told myself a story for many years. He swallowed hard. A story where I built everything alone. His eyes found mine across the room. But that wasn't true. Now people were listening carefully. Even the band members had stopped moving. Richard's voice trembled slightly. 26 years ago, my company was collapsing. My family was weeks away from losing everything. He paused. And another family stepped in quietly and saved us. I froze completely. Around the room, confusion spread among guests who clearly knew nothing about any of this. Richard continued. Thomas and Margaret Doyle mortgaged their future to help mine survive. The room went utterly still. And after I became successful, he lowered his eyes. I allowed myself to forget the people who carried me through failure. Evelyn was crying silently now. Real tears, not elegant ones. Richard looked directly at me. Margaret, I am deeply ashamed of how you were treated in my home. Nobody moved. Nobody even touched their drinks. Then Richard said the one thing that finally broke the room open emotionally. Thomas Doyle was a better man than I became after money found me. And for the first time all evening, I saw people stop looking at me like I came from less. About 6 months after the wedding, I was standing in the church pantry, sorting canned soup beside Evelyn Whitmore, when she accidentally dropped an entire box of macaroni onto the floor. For one stunned second, the former queen of country club perfection simply stared at the mess around her expensive shoes. Then she started laughing. Real laughing. The kind people do when they finally get tired of pretending life can still be controlled. I laughed too. And somewhere between tomato soup labels and dented green beans, two women who once sat on opposite ends of a dining room quietly became something closer to human together. None of us changed overnight after the wedding. That only happens in movies. Real families soften gradually. One uncomfortable conversation at a time. Daniel and Claire moved into a modest brick home outside Columbus, instead of accepting Richard's offer to buy them a massive property near Chicago. I think that decision surprised everyone except me. The house had squeaky hardwood floors, outdated kitchen cabinets, a tiny backyard barely big enough for a grill. And they loved it immediately. Daniel called me one evening while replacing a garbage disposal himself. Dad would have made fun of how long this is taking me. He absolutely would have. Claire got involved too. Apparently she'd never used power tools before marriage. The first time she tried hanging shelves, she accidentally drilled into drywall without checking for wiring. Daniel said the scream she let out could probably be heard in 3 neighboring counties. That story still makes me smile. Their marriage felt healthier once they stopped trying to impress anybody. No performance. No competition. Just 2 people building a life slowly together the same way most Americans used to. Meanwhile, Richard changed in quieter ways. A few months after the wedding, he established a trade scholarship program in Thomas Doyle's name for working-class students entering electrical and construction fields. When he first told me about it over lunch, I nearly cried into my iced tea. Tom would have liked that, I said softly. Richard nodded. I hope so. And for the first time since I'd known him, he sounded less concerned about looking respectable and more concerned about actually becoming respectable. That's a very different thing. Evelyn surprised me most of all. At first, volunteering at church was clearly uncomfortable for her. She dressed too formally. Apologized constantly. Tried organizing everything into spreadsheets no one asked for. But eventually something shifted. One afternoon, I watched her sit beside an older widow named Carol for nearly an hour listening to stories about medical debt and loneliness. Not pretending to listen. Actually listening. Later, Evelyn admitted quietly, I spent years donating money without ever standing close enough to pain to recognize it. That sentence stayed with me for days. Because it was honest. And honesty changes people if they let it. As for Daniel, my son became softer after all of this. Not weaker, just softer. He started visiting more often, calling more often, listening more carefully. One Saturday, he helped me clean out the garage where Thomas used to keep his tools. Very few remained. Daniel picked up an old socket wrench and stared at it for a long time. I used to think Dad didn't leave much behind. I folded an old work blanket carefully. "Oh, honey," I said quietly, "your father left everything behind." Daniel looked at me then with tears in his eyes. And at 64 years old, I finally felt something I hadn't fully allowed myself to feel in years. Seen. Not admired. Not pitied. Seen. There's a difference. Sometimes people think revenge stories are about punishment, about humiliating the people who hurt you. But age teaches you something different. The deepest kind of revenge is often simply surviving long enough for the truth to walk into the light on its own. No screaming. No destruction. Just reality finally arriving where performance used to live. I still keep the photo album on my coffee table now. The same one Evelyn nearly dismissed because it arrived inside a paper pharmacy bag. Funny thing is, Claire studies it every time she visits. She loves the ordinary photographs most. Thomas asleep in the lawn chair. Daniel covered in mud after Little League. Me holding a birthday cake with frosting sliding sideways because our air conditioner broke that summer. Nothing expensive. Nothing polished. Just proof that love existed there. And maybe that's what people forget sometimes after chasing status too long. The most valuable things families pass down usually aren't impressive from the outside. Dignity. Sacrifice. Mercy. The ability to help someone without needing applause afterward. Those things rarely come wrapped perfectly. But they last longer than almost anything money can buy. Last Sunday after church, Richard stood beside me in the parking lot watching young families load children into minivans. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I spent half my life trying to become important." I smiled faintly. And he looked toward the gray Ohio sky. "Turns out being decent matters more." Thomas would have liked hearing that. And if you've ever loved someone quietly, sacrificed without recognition, or carried your family through hard seasons nobody else fully saw, I hope this story reminds you that those things mattered more than the world may have told you at the time. Sometimes our children understand late. Sometimes people apologize late. Sometimes truth arrives late. But late is still better than never. And if this story touched something in your heart, feel free to share it with someone who still needs reminding that kindness and dignity never go out of style. Thank you for spending this time with me.